Thanks to all the contributors this evening, and thank you for the invitation to be here with you in Pristina. My name is Eleanor Beaumont. I'm Deputy Editor at the Architectural Review. The AR published its first issue 130 years ago in November 1896. It's always been based in London, but has an international agenda. It's never been about the workaday business of architecture. The first editor, Henry Wilson, wrote in 1900 that the AR is the only magazine in the British Empire dealing with the artistic as distinguished from the business side of architecture. Today, under the editorship of Manon Mollard, the AR argues that both of these sides are in fact entangled with architecture's political, economic, ecological and social context. So it's here that we now train our gaze. Manon and I have been working together at the AR since 2017. These are some of the issues that we've made together. Whereas previous editors might have reshaped the magazine in their own image with radical redesigns and breaks with the past, we see ourselves more as stewards, guiding and taking care of the AR on its journey. There's been no grand redesign since we started our guardianship, but instead a slow, incremental evolution, testing ideas and building a spatial editorial practice. This practice is collective. We work very collaboratively. We even write the editorial collectively, like an exquisite corpse, kind of writing paragraph, sentence by sentence, paragraph by paragraph. We place things on the metaphorical and physical table, moving them around, cutting them up. We're a team predominantly of trained architects, so perhaps it's natural that we approach each issue like a building project with a site, the pages of the magazine, a site boundary, the edges of each page, 230 by 280 mil, site conditions and limitations, materials, we work with different paper stocks, a budget, a timescale, and deadlines, which I had yesterday, some people will know. And many, many, many collaborators and hands guiding it towards completion. So just like a building. This spatialized practice owes a great deal to Jane Rendell from the Bartlett and her concept of site writing, that writing is the site of building and architecture is written and spoken about with words as much as built. But also of situatedness. The constellation of us as editors based in London, our readers all over the world, and our contributors, who are different distance from us, both geographically but also in terms of discipline. And each contributor has a different spatial relationship to their subject. Most of the time, it's important that a writer or photographer has a closeness to the subject, to the building or geography, for practical travel reasons, but also to have an intimate understanding and reading of that place. But it can also be important to have critical distance, and always important that contributors are able to be critically independent. As editors, we see ourselves as mediators between our collaborators and our readers, and we are certainly not experts on the subject matter of each piece, but we are, humbly, specialists in making the AR. We ask the questions that our readers will likely ask, push writers to build solid arguments, and challenge the language they use and assumptions they make about what our readers might be familiar with. And in our work with and around crisis, particularly in Palestine, this practice is thrown into sharp relief. The AR is no stranger to crisis. It survived 2 world wars, during which time these crises even manifested physically in the fabric of the magazine. Chunky issues slimmed right down as paper was rationed and was more difficult to get hold of. But during the Second World War, the AR seemed reluctant to address the crisis, waiting until July 1941, which is this issue, 2 years into the war, to run a series of issues dedicated to destruction and reconstruction. An editorial introduction to this issue admitted that this was the first time that the AR had discussed matters arising directly from the war. The editors attributed this to a determination to continue their cultural production as if nothing had changed, which is a very British keep calm and carry on mentality. But they insisted that whatever is meant by culture does not become less important in war, but more. But by 1941, the AR felt a responsibility to furnish appropriate obituary notices for those buildings destroyed and was motivated to influence public opinion on architecture in town and planning, in their words, an essential step towards launching an enlightened legislative policy. And this, as we'll see later on in this talk, is an ambition that endures today. On Palestine, however, the AR has historically been at best disinterested and uncritical, and at worst complicit, a legacy that is important for us to address. For example, a 1979 issue included fairly positive coverage of a housing development in northern Israel described as a modern little Jewish town. It was in fact built on the Palestinian village of Mughra al-Khait, which was destroyed during the Nakba of 1948, and of which there is no mention in the piece. Criticism of Israel or discussion of the violence against Palestine went unmentioned in the AR until a couple of articles in 2015 and 2016. Reckoning with this legacy is serious work. We often say in the office that we look back to look forwards. We revisit the archive and reflect on our editorial blind spots, being critical of its male colonial gaze. And this is our 1500th issue. That's how many issues there were. This was in April 2023. I think we just sent to press the 1533rd issue yesterday. We asked writers to revisit specific issues and pieces from the archive, including Empire Timber in a 1936 issue, and discussion of vernacular so-called primitive huts in 1954 to critically assess this archive. And I must be clear that this is ongoing work. We do not pretend that we have completed the work of decolonising the AR. Since beginning our guardianship of the AR in 2017, we have been dedicated to crafting an editorial agenda that is determined to address the colonial project in Palestine and elsewhere. Themes help us to filter and sharpen our gaze. The Architectural Review has been a thematic magazine since 2015. So each of our 10 print issues a year has a different theme. However, there are some threads that weave through each issue, regardless of the theme: climate emergency, capitalism, extractivism, colonialism. So for this reason, we've never done a colonialism issue or a climate emergency issue. Instead, these questions are asked in every issue. For example, this issue on the screen was our repair issue in February 2024, which addressed repair and reuse at various scales, from the material and the building to the urban, regional, national, and even planetary scale, and in the process discussing ecological repair, degrowth, and as I'll discuss in more detail, restoration in the West Bank and reconstruction in Gaza. These themes are then given structure and shape by a jigsaw of puzzle pieces. So most issues are framed by a keynote, while the key puzzle pieces are building studies, and there are other pieces like building revisits, book reviews, and other essay types, which allow us to approach and talk about a subject in different ways. And through these different themes and pieces, the AR has addressed violence against Palestine from many angles and through different lenses. And a good example of how these jigsaw pieces come together is the keynote of our Ground issue in September 2024, where we invited the Palestinian architect and artist Dima Srouji to write about the evidence in the ground of both violence against Palestinians and their resilience. In this piece, she writes of the, and I quote, complex and entangled subterranean web of time, memory, life, and death through archaeological sites like this one, networks of tunnels and tombs, and archaeology above ground, how urban ruins are used by Palestinian communities every day. Most powerfully, Dima writes about how archaeology is being created beneath layers of rubble on a daily basis. And just a gentle trigger warning that this quote is quite a vivid recounting of acts of genocide. Dima writes, Palestinian parents who were preparing family lunches, children intent on their homework or playing board games, are now part of this archaeology. Their remains are evidence of Palestinian life preserved in the ground. As such, their deaths do not end their roles as active members of the Palestinian resistance. Gazans beneath the rubble may in fact still be alive now, a stratum of living evidence. Describing the ground as an archaeology of the living and the dead, in the case of Gaza, is literal. This piece, like every piece we published, was the result of an extensive collaborative process with Dima and the other AR editors, before also involving our sub-editor, art director, and picture editor over the course of almost 2 months. The first draft was handed between the 3 editors. We had long conversations about guiding the text, testing different structures, and adding over 30 comments, some of which you can see on the screen now, from structural changes to granular wording suggestions. And we see an edit as a dialogue and a testing ground, making room to follow a path further or dig deeper, challenging writers to clarify their meaning and communicate their thoughts even more clearly. For keynotes, the editors, art director, and picture editor all research images, resulting in hundreds of images sometimes. And here's a selection of the many images that we collected for this keynote, of which only 8 were chosen. We carefully checked the sources of each image, who made it, what it depicts, which is now becoming even more important with AI-generated images and doctored images. And our image choices avoid a kind of glorification of violence or poverty or suffering, and are careful that the author and the subject matter of the image is appropriate and respectful to the meaning of the piece. We consider the authors of images, platforming a mix of photographers and artists wherever possible. But we also hope to intrigue and engage our readers using unexpected or less seen images. We consider pairs of images and how they work together, as you can kind of see here. We enjoy a visual rhyme, you can see in this pairing. We pay attention to the visual story of the piece. Here it felt really important to close with the ongoing, enduring daily life and resilience of the Palestinian people, as Dima closes the text with a quote, "A vibrant, enduring culture that refuses to be extinguished." A large proportion of our pages is devoted to buildings. Buildings reproduce and represent the world around them. They embody power struggles, political compromises, ecological concerns, and we use buildings as a way into broader stories. A good example of this is the building study that we did of Riwaq's restoration of historic buildings at Kafur Akab, which we've just heard about. This was in the repair issue, and this was commissioned in November 2023, and it was just weeks after the 7 October attacks and the early days of the genocide in Gaza. As an editorial team, we were very torn as to whether it was appropriate to reach out to the architects, to Dana, in the midst of this unfolding tragedy, with such an arguably trivial proposal, demanding time and attention. But also how safe and sensible it was to ask a writer and a photographer to travel and visit the project in the West Bank with increasing violence and suppression. We understood it was both the most difficult and the most urgent time to bring Riwak's brilliant work to the attention of our readers. So we reached out to Dana and Saja Mansour, the project architect, with an open question about how best to give voice to this work at this kind of imaginably challenging time. They were very generous and enthusiastic about the prospect of including the project in the issue, and they agreed to collaborate on a piece, for which we're endlessly grateful. We reached out to the architect and researcher Lizanne Munaya, then based in Palestine, but as we found out, had been visiting family in Germany the day before the war broke out. And I've lost my... where I am in the... Yes, was visiting family in Germany the day before the war started and was yet to return, so was actually still in Germany. And we are very proud and think it's very important that AR writers visit every building that we publish as a building study. But given the circumstances, we settled on a plan that Lizanne was shown around the site virtually and held interviews with those involved. We also reached out to the photographer Yasmin Omari to photograph the project. She was based in Ramallah. She told us that although Israeli authorities had been limiting movement between cities in the West Bank, she could access Kafur Akab without crossing the new checkpoints, and so she could undertake the commission safely. I'll go through this quite quick. Oh. Okay. I'll go through this quite quickly as we've already been introduced to this project. But visually, we took the reader from south to north, with a mixture of kind of before and after imagery to show the work that Riwak had undertaken to resuscitate the site. Our drawings editor edits every drawing we publish, and this project was no exception. And as we've heard about today, Lizanne anchored the project in the contemporary moment, describing the way that villages like this one were severed from Jerusalem by the Israeli segregation wall, and ended the piece by describing both the social reconstruction of the local community as well as the building's physical restoration. Another type of piece which gives us a way into a subject is reviews, which we include in our Book of Books, which is a semi-regular section in the magazine of pieces that use books, films and exhibitions as jumping off points. It's also a narrower page size on a thin kind of newsprint stock, so it acts like a book in the book. We actually want to do a book of books at some point. And this is in our Tree issue in October 2021. And we commissioned artist and writer Liat Badugo to write one of these pieces, drawing on Ilya Suleiman's 2019 film, It Must Be Heaven, as well as Iris Braverman's 2009 book, Planted Flags, and Shaul Ephraim Cohen's The Politics of Planting, to argue that trees have been used strategically to seize, hold, and control territory. She asks, what could be involved about planting a tree? Trees are assumed to be natural, innocent, ecological entities with no say in politics, but instead are part of a covert war that mobilizes ecology to fix and create geopolitical facts in the region. She goes on, colonization is precisely the point of afforestation, with trees planted over destroyed Palestinian villages to prevent the residents' return. The text also has a poignant personal angle. Liat herself had planted a pine sapling as a young child, in her words, enacting the mythology of the Zionist halutza, or pioneer, the labourer whose physical exertion creates intimate connection with the land through planting a pioneer ecological tree species. This thread of inquiry was picked back up in September 2025, when Sufi Boyce reported on wildfires for our Outrage column in the Forest issue. Outrage, as a feature, has its roots in the critic Ian Nairn's 1955 Outrage issue for the AR, which decried the UK's suburban sprawl. Today, it's an opinionated and polemical column with a nice, short, spicy word count. And Sufi added to Liat's discourse with scrutiny of where the colonial nature of the forests intersects with the climate catastrophe. While global heating was primarily blamed for the forest fires by Israeli ministers, Sufi points to the significant role played by the makeup of the forests themselves, which you've heard a bit about today, predominantly made up of non-native species, such as pines, cypress and eucalyptus, which were chosen because of their European appearance and because they're fast-growing, but they're also very flammable. And this is one example of a piece that uses unfolding events almost as an excuse to reassess and scrutinize the ongoing colonial project in Palestine. As a print publication, our pace is inherently slower than rolling news. So it means that responding to current affairs is more challenging. Beyond the Ceasefire by Noor Abu Zaid, Davide Piscitelli, and Ashraf Hamdan from Forensic Architecture was originally commissioned to be part of our February 2025 extensions issue on the subject of Israel's annexation of Palestinian territory. The piece was commissioned in December with a draft filed in January, by which time a supposed ceasefire had been announced. And this meant the piece had to be updated to reflect those developments, but also felt even more urgent, arguing that the settler colonial project would persist regardless of so-called ceasefire. We made the decision at the end of January, when the February issue was going to press, to publish online only, to give us flexibility to respond to events as they happened. And the final paragraph was still being revisited in February, when Trump announced plans to redevelop the territory into the Riviera of the Middle East. We finally published the text on the 27th of February. And being attentive to the changing situation in the region is always important. This piece about the Negev as a frontier for the Israeli Zionist project was written by Eric Katz for our Desert issue. It was first commissioned in August 2023, went to press on 22nd of September, and the issue landed on the 2nd of October 2023. Just 5 days later were the 7th of October attacks, including in the Negev desert. The piece was not published online until fairly recently, on request of the writer, who had personal connections to the region. And although both Irit and we as editors stood by everything she had written, it did not feel like the right time in the days immediately following the attacks to promote the story online. The last piece I want to talk about today is Rebuilding Gaza by the architect and historian Nadi Abu Sada. This piece was also in our repair issue and was a pitch that Nadi sent us, which is a rare occasion when a pitch out of the blue is aligned with the upcoming theme and all the jigsaw pieces fall into place. We commissioned it straight away. The pace of erasure surpasses that of history writing, Nadi writes. The bulldozer is faster than the pen. And in light of what would then come to the fore 12 months later with Trump's plans to redevelop Gaza, Nadi's piece is an eerie prophecy. He writes, one group remains conspicuously absent from the discourse, the Palestinians, the people of Gaza. He reminds us that this is no surprise, that the 2014 Gaza reconstruction mechanism granted Israel the upper hand in controlling the entry of construction materials and other imports necessary for rebuilding the city's basic infrastructure. He concludes, the question of reconstruction cannot be divorced from the need for the de-Zionization and reunification of Palestine. I wanted to close this talk not with a piece, well, this is a piece, but it speaks to a broader story that touches on the many other aspects of our roles as editors of the AR. This is a piece we published on the occasion of Suad Amiri, the founder of RIWAC, being awarded the Ada Louise Huxtable Prize in 2025 as part of the W Awards for women and non-binary people working in and around and with architecture, which the AR co-organises with our sister publication, the Architect's Journal. We held an event during the opening of the Venice Architecture Biennale in May last year, inviting Suad and the other winners, which included Anne Lacaton, Amber Winnick from Designing Motherhood, and 8 other architects from around the world that were shortlisted as part of the awards. Suad's presentation was characteristically warm and compelling. For those who might have visited or heard about the 2025's Biennale, curated by Carlo Ratti, Suad's talk was a rare moment of humanity that week in Venice, and an even rarer discussion of the genocide in Gaza and ongoing violence in Palestine. One member of the audience explained later that the talk had encouraged her to change her position on Israel's occupation of Palestine. She had previously been sympathetic to the Zionist project and described how Suad's talk had changed her perspective. And of course, we take no credit for Suad's words or power, but for us, this was a real crystallization of our editorial practice, giving Suad a platform and exposing an audience to her clarity and her passion in a landscape that too often neglects the violent suppression of Palestine. And we've since actually published a transcript of her talk on the AIA website, so you too can have a read. Like every institution and aspect of public life, the AR is not immune to efforts by the Israel lobby to silence and influence. We have been actively warned from inside our own company not to address the question of Palestine. We have received criticism from influential architects and writers, and even been sent an intimidating letter from the Board of Deputies. It's also important that I'm clear that the AR is not a charity or a non-profit. We are owned by a private company with commercial interests and demands, and we are funded primarily by our readers through subscriptions, which allow our editorial activity to continue, to pay writers and photographers, to allow them to travel and witness firsthand. And the pieces I've spoken about today are just a small selection from our recent archive on the subject of Palestine, but also elsewhere. We've recently covered projects in refugee camps in Kurdistan, on the Mexico-US border, up mountain peaks in the Alps, Soviet-era housing in Uzbekistan, and much, much more. I've actually got some issues with me today, which I would very much like to leave here in Pristina for you all to have a look at. We invite you to explore online, support us if you can, and thanks very much, and free Palestine.